Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Welcome back for season 21 of the podcast. Today we're talking about The Penguin, the 8-episode series currently streaming on HBO Max. And we're going to go deep on costume design. Happy to welcome back costume designer Helen Huang. Helen, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you too, Skid.
Also returning to the show is assistant costume designer Austin Wittick. Austin, welcome back.
Hi, Skid. Thanks for having us.
I'm very excited to have you both here. This is a great series. That's not a spoiler, but a warning for listeners. The Penguin is airing now. Episode 6 of 8 premieres today. And while there may be spoilers about the first half of the season, we won't spoil any plot points for episodes that haven't aired. So first, some context. This series is a spin-off and sequel to 2022's The Batman, director Matt Reeve's take on the iconic superhero with Robert Pattinson in the title role. The Penguin was a supporting character in the film, played by an almost unrecognizable Colin Farrell. Now, the costume designer for the film was Jacqueline Duran, whose resume includes 9 Oscar nominations and 2 wins. So, Helen, to start us off, how do you approach a project where someone else's costume work is already established as a baseline?
I think that was like a overall conversation about how to do the series, what we need to take from the original movie, and then what we need to expand upon. And so, like, for cinematically and for our DPs, it was very much about keeping the night look and the interiors the same as the ones from the movie. But because the movie didn't have a lot of day scenes, they had to translate that aesthetic into what it would look like for daytime. And same thing with like the costumes. We looked at the overall silhouette of what she did. We had all of the physical costumes there so we could look at the fabric choices and everything. But the next step was to have a conversation with Colin about what he wants to look like as Oz in this series, because, you know, we go so much more in depth on his character. Personally, I really wanted to have a dress down of Oz, so take him out of the suits, you know, because of the arc, make him a more casual person, and then also provide him with some like lived in world pieces that contrast with, you know, sort of like the comic book persona that he has, and, you know, even the film persona that he's had. And Colin felt the same, and he really wanted us to feel more grounded, and he really wanted him to feel, I mean, obviously, because you're doing the Penguin, there has to be a larger than life element to it, but he did want it to feel not costumey, but like very grounded and real. And so we decided to take him out of the 2-piece suits. That was a big decision in the beginning. So he was wearing separate. So a blazer on top, a dress pant on the bottom. And then we took the shape of the iconic black trench coat that he wore in the movie and made it into like a 1970s leather jacket. And so it was like kind of taking that translation and then keeping elements of it and then furthering developing it for specifically for the series. And then we took him out of, you know, the garish colors, even with the purple that we did, the purple blazer in the series, we chose a more muted purple, but we did keep, you know, the shoe silhouette and everything from the movie. So there was definitely like a dissecting of like different silhouette choices and different fabric choices of what they did in the movie, and then bringing it into our own DNA, sort of, so to speak.
What sort of prep time do you get for pulling something like this together?
Austin, what do you say? 4 months? 3 months?
3 months. I think was
3 months. We had a 3 months lead into it. You know, but we did sort of, and then, you know, Matt Reeves was like very kind and had very big references for what he wants the show to look like. So it was very much like French Connection. It was very much Clute. It was very much Scarface. And so what I took from that, and then also what I took from his movie, is this cinematic emotion that he really wants and likes in this very grounded world. And so we took it and applied it to just the characters that were now there. And so I really approached the series as almost like a period piece. Like nobody was supposed to be in contemporary. We looked at silhouettes from all periods and tried to, like, for example, Oz is very like, he's got really, really big lapels. So it was very much like almost like 1940s, 1970s, where the lapels were really, really big and the roll lines were a little bit longer, just to play with his proportions. And so it was like little things like that, was to take away some of the contemporary how they make clothes and then remake it into the thing that would make him special but not so distracting.
Helen, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You said both the 1940s and the 1970s served as a reference point.
I meant to say both.
Okay, good.
I think it was because in the 40s they had bigger lapels and in the 70s they had bigger lapels. So it wasn't exactly, and periods like repeat themselves. So
when you talk about the conversation with Colin, I want to ask some practical questions in
yeah.
figuring out his costume in light of all these prosthetics. That just seems like another level. And I'm curious what it was for him to get ready to even have the practical fittings take place.
So in our first fitting, they had to put almost like half a face of prosthetics, so everything from eyes down on, just because we had to get sort of the shoulder width and then because he wears a lot of suits and dress shirts, the neck collar, right? And then we also had to discuss like how far down all the prosthetics go. So how far down his necklines can be open to, like if you wore a t-shirt, how far down that goes. Because, we did talk a lot about exposing more skin on Oz this time. Because I think his body was like a big point, in the story. So he did get into that the first few times for us to just get it right. But once we kind of got the dimensions right and we understand how to make his clothes, we actually had a Oz, what do you call it? Mannequin, Austin? Like Oz mannequin.
Yeah, mannequin dress form.
Yeah. That had pieces of his prosthetics on the mannequin in dress form. And so we would have Oz in the tailoring room and we'd try it on the mannequin before we would go into fittings with Colin. But towards the end, we got it down pretty well to where he doesn't need to be in it for us to have the fittings. And then also we got it down to where like I'd pitch him an idea for what he's wearing. And then we would try it, that outfit, maybe like we would try it 10 minutes after or before he works. And so he's already in the full prosthetics. And then he would put it on and we would get an idea of what it like looks like. So we got it down to a pretty good science. But it was challenging in the beginning just because it was like the hair and makeup team, like the makeup team had to be there to do it.
So while we're talking about Colin, how did he take to it all? Again, he is the primary character of this series, obviously, but that's a lot of prosthetic work. That would make me grumpy. Again, you talk about the engagement, and it is a constant theme when we talk about costumes. You bringing in the actor and how they think about the character as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how it was working with Colin through these challenges.
I mean, Colin was a dream. He never complained. Yeah, I've never met someone who is in so much. It's probably like really uncomfortable from what I gather, but he never complained. He was always super nice to everyone on set, right? Austin, like he was like such a dream and he's like lovely.
He's so lovely. And like I think it took maybe what 2 to 3 hours, if not more, every morning to get him into the prosthetics.
Yeah.
So it's a large chunk of time for him to sit in the chair every morning
And then to take it out.
and then take it out afterwards. And having your skin be so raw, it makes you so much more, I think, sensitive to your skin, sensitive to everything. But he never really complained. He was always, very professional throughout the whole process.
And I think he was always aware, and this happens with like a lot of actors that work on that level that he works on, is like they understand what it takes in the attitude that needs to have to be number one on a show. And I think that it sets the tone for everybody else. And so he's always been really responsible in that way and always very giving about giving you time to do your job. I think that's a big thing too about this, because if he didn't give us the time in the beginning, we would not have reduced the time towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what was it like fitting the stunt players who are in his role? Do they also have prosthetic costumes that they had to wear? Or because again, there's actually quite a bit of stunt work in this,
Yeah.
even for the penguin character. I'm curious if there were any special challenges there.
They did have a stunt player. They did very minimal prosthetics. So it was like a guy who had sort of the dimensions for at least from the back as Oz, the character. But from everything I've heard on set, they never used him. Colin really likes doing his own stunts, and he doesn't like, people to body double him because I think he understands that Oz has particular movements that he wants to do. So he was always a professional like that. But I don't know how he does it. But from what I've heard, they've never really used him except for some driving shots.
Even down to hand. I remember it being,
Yeah.
I want them to do like any kind of like hand doubles. Like he wanted to do the hand movements himself because he was so particular.
It really speaks to his professionalism and how exact he is as an actor. So glowing reviews all around.
All around.
Indeed. Well, taking a step back, give me a sense of what the production was like, where you filmed. You talked about having 3 to 4 months of prep. How long was actual filming and what was that like overall?
Well, it was in New York. So we went to New York. When did we go to New York? Early November, right?
Early November,
Yeah.
we were there until about June, I believe, of the following year, which is when the writer strike happened. And then we broke for about 4 months. And then we came back, I think
To
literally
finish it, yeah.
again in November. We were there for about 4 months until February to finish it. So it almost felt like a year in total.
Yeah. But working in New York is wonderful just because the city is really lovely. We enjoyed being there, obviously. To be paid to work in New York is and to live in New York, that's kind of amazing. But I think New York is logistically incredibly challenging. We had no idea coming from, because we've worked in Toronto and Atlanta and New Orleans, but we had no idea the set of challenges, like logistical challenges you would have in New York. Everything took twice as long because of the way, even traffic was. And the fact that in New York, you don't have a base camp and it's just like trucks lying down 9 blocks. And usually, sometimes, like I would be like, oh, I don't want to pick out the earrings like now. Let's look at what they look like in the morning and then we'll pick it out. But then you have to like run around 8 blocks. And so, towards like after 2 weeks, I was like, we're setting the earrings like in the office tonight. I'm not gonna run around um, like downtown Manhattan because I can't figure out her earrings the night before.
Helen usually does so much research beforehand on projects. She usually talked to like people who've worked there on, past projects. And it was very hard to quantify on this when people were telling us like logistically, it's going to be very hard. Your resources are going to be stretched no matter, how much money you have. But once you get there, you really understand like it's a very, very different ball game compared to LA, Toronto, Vancouver. Like it's a very unique atmosphere to try and get a production done in New York.
Yeah. There is no like, oh, can you just run to Warner Brothers and pick up these costumes at 7 a.m. in the morning? It's like if you don't have it, you don't have it.
Yeah, if you don't have it, you don't have it, and you got to move on with the day. Like there's nothing is a quick fix in that city at all.
Well, you guys have been working together for a while. In fact, I think the last time you were both here, we talked about your work on Beef. Remind our listeners how the two of you work together and how the division of labor sorts out.
Well, Austin is basically my second brain. He's one of the best person because he's very creative, but extremely linear and organized. And I think like I do a lot of research and I do need sometimes like help filtering out the ideas because I'll have like 5 or 6 or 7 things I really like. And then I'll ping them off Austin because we've worked together for so long. And he'll be like, okay, well, like he'll ask the right questions so I can narrow it down. And then I always trust if Austin says he loves something, I'll pursue it. If he says that's cute, I'll be like, scratch that idea. But it shows how much I value like his opinion. And I think, an ACD is whatever the designer really needs, right? So on certain projects, the ACD needs to be super organized on the calendar, on what actors are. So they basically help you plan and manage the department. The ACD could be that. Or they could be your creative right hand to where they execute what you want. Austin is a bit of a chameleon because he could do both depending on, if we go to a city, what the personnel there, what they're strong at, and then they'll do that. And then he will fill in what I need for the rest of it. And so I think that's invaluable. Also, he's a bud, and going, you have to take someone with you to places that you love, to places that you go to, because like you have such a shorthand with someone that you've worked with for a long time, and you will never ever get that with a person you just met.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know your brain, you don't really know how the communication works, and it's very invaluable. So I like to say, if there's any costume designers listening and they've never been out of town, insist on taking your ACD with you out of town.
I had just mentioned this to Skid right before we started the podcast. I was like, there's something to be said about having, the ability and kind of maybe sometimes writing it into your deal to take an assistant with you, just because whether it's the social factors or the work factors, having somebody there that you have known to bring along with you to these distant locations is extremely, invaluable because it's very, very hard, I think, to get the work done, but also just to like outside factors of having someone you can socialize with. Like those two things
Yeah.
I think are very, very important.
Also, I have to say, I don't trust anybody to pull images for research to pitch to directors, only Austin. I've never let anybody put together a deck for me. Only he puts together because he knows exactly how I like it, what images I would find exciting. And then he's very good at like understanding what story we're trying to tell. And so, yeah, when I say he's like literally my other brain, it's not a joke.
I'm the catch-all. Years of
He's
cultivating the same taste.
Well, we talked about Colin and his role as the Penguin.
Mhm.
I also want to ask you about the character arc for Sophia, who was played by Kristen Milioti.
Mhm.
Since she's not in the film, Helen, you get to design pretty much from scratch. Talk to me about her arc over the series and the challenges of her costume.
I think the challenges for any woman in a DC universe or any comic book universe is her femininity in general, and how do you like costume that. I know that I always feel a great sense of responsibility to female characters to try and think about them in a dimensional way. And so when we talked about her, we talked a lot about thematically about females being in this male dominated world, and how her costumes, when it starts out, should be how they view her, like their lens of her. So her femininity, her youth, her, even her beauty as their way to legitimacy. But I didn't want to put her in sort of skin tight clothing. We wanted to show the Falcone family in general as one of elegance. We looked at a lot of old European, old money photos, a lot of photos of Valentino from the 70s, even a lot of photos of Picasso in his studio in Barcelona. But it was like we wanted, European elegance, New York, East Side from the 1960s. And so it was a challenge to be like, what does that look like with Sophia? But I was very drawn to a lot of like Courage references, a lot of like Edie Sedgwick references, where the skirt and hemline are obviously girly and shorter, but the waist isn't as defined in that time period. And then there is something rebellious about that type of girliness. There is something not quite fitting into convention with that type of girliness. And then I saw this series of pictures from Harper's Bazaar, 1994. Peter Lindenberg shot Kate Moss in Rome. And it was like the 90s take on the 60s dress through 90s minimalism. And I was like, that's it. That's Sophia. And so I think that's when we really started to understand what her silhouette was, what clothing we should order in for her, what clothing we should make for her, because she had a lot of made pieces. Like the white suit she had at the beginning, that was made by us to resemble a 1960s two-piece set. And it has definitely Courage influences. And then yeah, it was just about showing the audience something a little bit more unusual. And I think that's what I mean when I say like I really wanted the characters to feel timeless because I really wanted to go through the trouble of, not giving them, buying them things that were from like in the department stores. Austin sourced every vintage vendor underneath the sun for Sophia's costumes and like was a slave to online vintage ordering. Like we would get like 5 pieces in one day, 10 pieces in another. It was like a slog, but we did it.
It's a very slow process. It's a very slow and intricate process because most of those designer shops do not have everything you're looking for in one kind of shop. So you have to go piece by piece and you really have to just slowly go down the list and kind of cultivate a very well-rounded shop, but it takes quite a lot of dealers to kind of get to that final, well-rounded shop.
Which actually New York was good for because New York has a lot of really good vintage dealers.
I would say out of all the places we've been so far, I think they have the most vintage dealers that really just have great stock. They have great stock. They have unique stock. I think the prices are not that bad. And I can't imagine doing this show in another city because I think it would have been very, very hard to kind of get the pieces we needed.
Yeah. And they understand they dealt with production. So they would like lend us the clothes for the fittings and we would buy what we want to keep. Versus we've been into a lot of places, Europe included, where that is not a thing that they do.
Yeah.
You have to buy everything first.
In my opinion, actually, it was a little more easier sometimes than LA because especially the bigger designer stores, the like brick and mortars of like Prada, Gucci, Brioni, they would let us take it on consignment, which I had not interacted with or had the experience of in LA, and it makes it that much easier to just kind of do fittings and shops, because there's a shorthand of them letting you take it out, you do your fitting, you bring it back.
Yeah.
Whereas, like Helen was saying, in other cities, it's far more complicated and a longer process, and it makes it harder to
Yeah.
get it out for fittings.
And then going back to your question, as Sophia like progressed, we really wanted to have her have a metamorphosis. And so we did try to change her shape more with texture and silhouette. And also, in the beginning, she was quite buttoned up. And towards the middle, you see more neck, you see more skin. And I like to think of that as a woman coming into her power and kind of having ownership over her body. And so we really did try to dress her, especially midway through and then towards the end, where yes, it does seem more revealing, but she's having fun with it. She's playing with it. She has ownership over her image. And I think that's really important for the character because for the longest time, it was other people's image of her that she had to confine to and conform to.
Talk to me about some of your other favorite characters, whether the major supporting players or minor characters that maybe don't catch people's eyes, but still take a significant amount of work to pull off their costuming.
I mean, Austin has.
I thoroughly enjoyed the process of costuming for Eve, Roxy, Alice, and Cinnamon, which were our four sex workers. And I think that all too often there's like a very tropey kind of recipe essentially that's done for sex workers in film and television. And I feel like for these four girls, it was very fun to kind of just break it down into a more grounded, realistic kind of interpretation of these girls' lives and, where they would get their articles of clothing from, how they move into day-to-day space. So for me, that was really kind of a very fun experience and a very creative kind of task
Yeah.
to get done.
And we did try to show them as like creative people who are in charge. Again, speaking of females on the show, who's like very in charge of their image. And so, they're dressed, yes, they would be dressed for men, but it's not sad because it's what they understand is the image that they're trying to project to these men. So it's not so much the men dominating their aesthetic as more as them understanding what their business is and then dressing to the way that they feel like would enhance their business by being in charge of their image. But especially with Eve, we spent a lot of time on her, and she was also mostly vintage clothing from the 70s, from the 80s, just to make her a little bit more timeless and a little bit harder to figure out.
And like for, I think just to make them a more, to just kind of explore the complexity of their lives, like the sex work is also just like one component of them, like doesn't necessarily define who they are as an entirety. So I think it's going beyond just this kind of, like Helen was saying, their job and like what they are, what their business is, and exploring other aspects of their life. And I think you can see a lot of that through their clothing.
Other characters that you guys were particularly proud of, or their arcs maybe we want to point out that people might not notice without the extra attention?
We're probably going to talk about Victor, but I love Victor. We spent so much time on him. I really felt like he was really Oz's like sole moral dilemma in the whole series. And Victor, we actually made all of his clothes for 1 through 3. And I really wanted his silhouette to be different than Oz because Oz had a very straight silhouette and a very sort of like tailored masculine in the traditional way silhouette. And I wanted Victor to feel more cocooned and bigger. And so we picked the 90s silhouette for him. He had so many multiples. He had one outfit that had a million multiples in the first 3 episodes. And so we took the time to remake and redesign a 1990s starter jacket for him. We even, inside he's wearing a red jacket, and that's vintage. We remade a vintage Fila jacket, but we gave it a different name. What was the name, Austin? I think you picked it out. It was like very weird. Like we even put a brand name on it because we wanted it to feel authentic. Because, a lot of times with these shows, like they take away like sports brands and brand names of sportswear. But I think when you do that, it makes like the articles of clothing look less real. And so every time we remake something, I would always put back all the little bits and pieces of the graphic. So then people unconsciously feel familiar to that. And we even like we made him a Gotham City
T-shirt.
basketball t-shirt because I was like, he's a kid, he's a teen, he would like sports. And so we're like, Matt, did you have any baseball teams in your movie? And he was like, yes. And so we remade like a classic 1990s like graphic of a Gotham City basketball t-shirt.
No, it was great. It was great. I think it's the remaking of graphics is kind of a new thing that I have been kind of shown through Helen. And I think it really does play a big role just because of the kind of iconography of graphics in general, but it's specifically sports graphics and logos. And I think when you do remove them, mainly because, clearance issues and whatnot with studios, you lose an aspect of the clothing. And so to be able to have this opportunity to get graphics made, cleared, and then be able to get them on the clothing, I think it really does help sell it to the audience that
This is a real world.
this is a real world and it's just a vintage sports tee or a vintage jersey.
So Renzi Felix played Victor, and when you talk about selling it to the audience, I also think that character is sort of our audience substitute in some ways,
Yeah.
navigating this world. Does that factor into doing the costume design, the fact that the audience is meant to feel closer to one character or another?
Um, no, actually that's a new layer, Skid. I might bring that into my next my next project. I think I've never thought so existentially before about this. But maybe that could be a new thing. No, but I didn't. I wasn't that smart. But Renzi also his character because I looked at a lot of Jamal Shabazz's photographs when I was researching, because I was researching the 1980s a lot for this, and then Frank Horvat. But Jamal Shabazz did these beautiful street photography portraits in the late 1970s, early 80s of like Brooklyn or Harlem youth.
Yeah.
And it was like the original sort of street style almost like mixed in with like documentation. And his character, I really wanted to represent that type of image and also that celebration of life outside of what it's like to be in contact with Oz.
Speaking of Renzi Felix, and again, also with Kristen Milioti, what did they bring to the collaboration on these costumes? Or again, at some point, there's too many people for each one to be a sit down, but I'm curious, these at least major supporting roles, what
Mhm.
that back and forth is like.
Um, I tried to show them the mood board for their images and asked if we could talk about it. I asked, sort of how they see the character and how they prepped for the character. I think with the both of them, when they came in, they had an idea of the character, but it was still earlier on in the process. And they were both so open, like very, very open people to what we were doing. And so they just tried on the clothes and just kind of let us do our thing. And I think as they got to know the character more in the later fittings, it was a process of like, oh, what do you think your character would wear for this sequence? How do you think they want to feel in this particular scene? And because they know their characters more and we know the visual DNA for their character, it became like a faster project. Like later on in the fittings with Kristen, it was like amazing, wasn't it?
Yes.
Like she was just like, yes, no.
I think she got more and more into it
Yeah.
as each of them both really got to explore the character more and knew the character more. I think
Hmm.
they're more into kind of just playing more and more into these kind of strong character choices that came out through the costumes. So I think that's always fun because in those first few fittings, you're really still trying to figure it out. But then when you get farther and farther into the rest of the fittings, you
Hmm.
can kind of get stronger
Your choices.
with the choices that you know are like these are much more in line with I think where we are with the character right now.
Yeah. It's weird because they grow and then we also grow with them. And pilot episodes are always such a challenge to get right. And if you really watch a series, the really, really confident, good costumes really come like towards midway
Yeah.
or the end because it kind of both things like sync up, the network or the studio relaxes a little bit and you get to make bolder choices and then they get to inhabit it more. But again, we got very lucky. There isn't like better actors than actors who come in being really open to what you do and not having a preconceived image in mind, because sometimes that almost stops the creative process. Because if you have an image in mind and you come in, A, does the image fit the show? That's one. And B, it might not be the most exciting thing because you need to discover what the most exciting thing is through fittings. That's what fittings are for. There are safe spaces for you to discover what the most interesting way to say what you need to say. And the first thing that comes to mind, whether it's for me or for them, is the wrong answer 100% of the time.
And you never hit a character
No,
right off the bat. Like I think the thing with
even if
Helen,
you have a good fitting, huh?
even if you have a good fitting, and I think the thing with Helen is that she is somebody who re looks over her fittings and analyzes her fittings and wants to get really the best outcome she can. And so she takes a second, a third, a fourth hit at everything. Nothing is ever a solid 10 out of 10. Even if it might be in somebody's world on that first fitting, she always looks at it again and be like, what can we do better? What can we amp up? What can we relook at? What maybe doesn't look so right? So let's take another look at it again. And I think that over kind of not over analyzing, I think the just the analyzing of it really kind of gets us the best product in the end.
I know this filming was like a year ago, you said, right? Where you guys were
Yeah.
working through on this. And so some of it's distant memory, but are there any specific stories or anecdotes that are still fresh in your mind as far as how this one went down? I mean, we talked about all these challenges. Anything you're like, oh, yeah, that was all those challenges turned up to 10.
Well, I mean, Austin was shopping in the rain a lot.
Lots of shopping in the rain, lots of long days of just Ubering place to place to place. There was one you came up with.
Oh, I thought of this. This was actually before, like really before we really hit the ground running with a lot of fittings. It doesn't even really have to do with fittings, but they were doing a table read, and it was the first time the studio was coming down, and Colin asked for a balaclava, and I had no idea why he wanted one. And it turned out he wanted to put it over his face so people be more concentrated on like what he was doing with his voice as Oz instead of on his face. And I was like, this show is going to succeed because that is dedication right there to do that, put in that much effort for a table read. That's amazing, you know? And I think that's one of the things I do want to tell is because production is always hard, 100% always hard. It's harder now because studios are, obviously downsizing, but they want the same product. But when you have directors and showrunners and actors that really come to the table with that type of commitment, that's how you get things done. That's how they get the product when they don't want to pay for it. Sorry, studios. Still hire me. Hire me. I'm willing to play ball, but you all gave us some real big challenges.
Well, speaking of the studio, now I know Warner Brothers and this whole DC universe is currently undergoing sort of a revamping under James Gunn, but it seems that Matt Reeves has been given his own sandbox to play in.
Yeah.
He's got the Batman, this series. There's a sequel to the Batman coming out. I'm curious what you know about the future of this franchise, or if you guys are willing to play in this sandbox again.
I mean, anytime Matt wants us to, we're here to come back and do something. Because it was so lovely. But we actually don't know that much. And the movie's being kept under quite a lot of wraps. But I hope they get to expand. I think him and his producing partner, Dylan, has a very specific idea of this universe. And it would be really fun to explore it further because there's so many Batman characters. Also, I love Batman, so whatever, any iteration, always.
Well, I know I'm looking forward to more of this as well. Fingers crossed. This was a great series. Really enjoyed talking about it with you guys. On that note, we'll call it a wrap. Great having you here.
Thank you, Skid.
Thanks, Skid.
Listeners, I always appreciate your feedback. You'll find my contact info on our website, belowtheline1word.biz. That's B-I-Z. You'll also find past episodes and links to all of our social media, so check it out. Where are we next going to see your work?
We are doing Blade Runner right now in Prague.
Okay. Well, I'm putting a pin in that. How's that shit going?
It's going well. It's hard. It's very hard, but it's going really well. I'm really excited. I think it'll be very exciting for people.
And is that the Prime series? Is Prime doing a 2099 series?
Yes. It's Prime 2099 with Michelle Yeoh and Hunter Schafer.
Okay, yes, we're putting a mark in that, and I'm saving you guys a spot on the release calendar. I'll have you back. My closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and to all of our listeners, I appreciate you. The Below the Line logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts and tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line.